Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy my video, please click the like button and share the video. It is the only way the YouTube algorithms really notices me. I will be very grateful to you. My imaginary friend still hides in the attic. Scary story published by Scare Fiction. Read for you by Scare Fiction. Chapter 1. The House Awakened. Sarah had never wanted to return to this place. Not after all these years. But here she was, standing at the foot of her childhood home, her fingers gripping the edge of the porch railing, the same one that had been painted a fading shade of white so long ago. The house loomed ahead, heavy with its years, its wood sagging and its windows dusted over with grime. Her mother's death had left Sarah with few ties to the world she'd once known, and now the house, in all its decaying glory, was the only thing left to remind her of what had been. She unlocked the front door with a shaky hand, the key cold and unfamiliar in her palm, and the smell of mildew hit her like a wave the moment she stepped inside. She'd forgotten how silent it was here. It was the kind of silence that clung to the walls, like the house itself was holding its breath. Sarah took a hesitant step forward, her foot sinking into the thin, musty carpet of the living room. Her eyes immediately went to the attic door, tucked away at the far end of the hall. It had been locked since she was a child. Her mother had always said it was unsafe, but she had never been allowed inside, not even for a peek. She set down her bag, her heart thudding in her chest. The house felt different now, larger somehow, as if the years had stretched it out to match the memories she had buried deep inside. As she moved through the house, dust floated in the air, thick and heavy, stirring only with the faintest breeze from the broken window. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, whispering with every step she took, as if the house was waking up too. A sudden chill brushed her skin, an unexpected draft that made her shiver. She paused, her breath catching in her throat. The air felt cold and wrong, like it was holding something back, something that had been waiting for her. Sarah scanned the room. Nothing moved, and yet there was a weight to the quiet that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. A faint creaking echoed from above the attic door. Sarah froze. Her eyes darted toward it, but she told herself it was just the house settling. Just an old building creaking under its own weight. She exhaled and forced her legs to move again, but her mind refused to quiet. Something about this house, something wasn't right. It wasn't just the dust or the decay. It was the feeling of being watched. A forgotten toy one she hadn't seen since childhood lay in the middle of the living room, an old cracked doll with button eyes. She stared at it for a long, long moment, her stomach twisting. Was it possible? Chapter 2. The Return of the Friend. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The silence of the house seemed to press in around her, thick and suffocating, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for her. The doll in the living room stared at her with its cracked button eyes, an eerie reminder of childhood, but Sarah pushed it out of her mind. It's just a doll. Just a toy. She wandered through the old house, each room more suffocating than the last. She hadn't intended to spend much time here, but she couldn't bring herself to leave either. Something kept pulling her back inside, something she couldn't quite name. The faint creaking from above, the persistent whisper of the wind. Through the cracks, everything felt wrong, but she couldn't put her finger on it. As she moved through the hallway, a glint of something caught her eye. It was an old photo album, half hidden beneath a pile of discarded books on the dusty side table in her mother's bedroom. Sarah bent down and pulled it free, the pages curling under the weight of time. Flipping through the brittle pages, Sarah's breath caught. There, nestled among faded family portraits, was a drawing one she hadn't seen in years. It was a crude sketch of a childlike figure with hollow, unsettling eyes and a smile too wide, too perfect. Below it, written in a child's scrawl, were the words, "My friend." A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine. The figure looked so real, as if it had been drawn only yesterday. She could almost feel the memories rising up from the depths, memories of long-forgotten games, whispered conversations in the dark. The friend, the one she had always said was imaginary, the one her mother had always said was just her imagination. But now, staring at the drawing, she wasn't so sure. The noise from the attic started again, soft, deliberate. A thud, a dragging sound. Her heart pounded in her chest. Slowly, she rose to her feet, turning toward the stairs. She had been avoiding the attic for years. She'd always been told it was off-limits, a place filled with old junk. But something about it tonight felt different. With shaking hands, she pushed open the attic door, the hinges groaning in protest. It was cold up there, a biting chill that seeped into her bones. She stepped inside, her flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. Dust swirled in the air, settling on the forgotten toys and old furniture, nothing more. The attic was empty. She sighed, the tension easing slightly. It's just an old house, she told herself. Nothing more. But then, later that night, as she lay in bed, the sound of soft footsteps echoed down the hallway. She froze, her heart in her throat. Sarah, a whisper, so familiar it made her skin crawl. Her name, like a long-lost memory. She told herself it was her imagination, but she knew better. Something was here, something real, and it wasn't done with her yet. Chapter 3, Uncovering the Truth. The footsteps had stopped, but the chill still lingered, curling around Sarah like a noose. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince herself it was all in her head, just the house settling, the old timbers groaning in the night. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just the house. It was him, the friend, the one she hadn't thought about in years. But now, with each passing day, the feeling of being watched, the creaking, the whispers, it was all growing stronger, more insistent. Sarah had to know more. She had to find out what was really happening in this place. The next morning, she went down to the basement and dug through boxes that hadn't been opened in decades. She found stacks of old photo albums, forgotten letters, and dusty keepsakes, relics of a life she had long ago left behind. But one thing caught her eye, an old, leather-bound journal that had belonged to her mother. She opened it cautiously, the pages yellowed and fragile. As she flipped through, she found entries that spoke of strange happenings, objects moving, shadows in the corners of the house, and, most unsettling of all, her mother's growing concern about Sarah's imaginary friend. Sarah spends too much time with him, one entry read, talking to him like he's real. I warned her to stop, but she doesn't listen. She's not safe in this house anymore. Sarah's heart pounded. She had completely forgotten about her mother's warnings. Had she really been that attached to her imaginary friend? The drawings, the whispered conversations, they had all seemed so innocent back then. Hadn't they? As she skimmed further, she found another entry. This one was more chilling. I can feel him watching me. He's in the house. The child, the thing she plays with, he's not like the others. He's something darker. Sarah slammed the journal shut, her hands shaking. Her mother had known. She'd known something was wrong all those years ago, something about that friend, but never told her. She couldn't remember the details, but they had to be buried somewhere in her mind. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from an old childhood friend, Jessie. Her heart skipped a beat as she read the text. Sarah, I've been thinking about you and your friend. Remember what happened at the house when we were kids? I'm sorry. I didn't want to scare you then, but I saw him too. Her hands trembled as she dialed the number. It rang 3 times before Jessie picked up, her voice cracked and uncertain. I knew you'd come back to the house, Jessie whispered. I never forgot what I saw. It wasn't just your imagination. He's real, Sarah. And he's still there. The blood drained from Sarah's face. Her friend remembered too. She had to face the truth. Whatever he was real. And now, he was coming for her. Chapter 4. The Attic Secrets. The house was silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that presses on your ears and makes your skin crawl. Sarah lay wide awake, staring into the pitch-black room, her mind buzzing with thoughts of Jessie's phone call. The weight of it all, her mother's warnings, the journal, the drawings felt like it was sinking in, drowning her in a sea of confusion and fear. But nothing felt as real as the sounds coming from above. Bam! A loud bang from the attic echoed through the house, sending a jolt of ice through Sarah's veins. She froze, listening as the noise reverberated down the hall. It was followed by a soft scraping sound, like nails dragged across wood. And then, unmistakably, a child's giggle, a high-pitched, innocent sound that was anything but. Sarah's heart raced. The noise was coming from the attic. She threw off the covers, her body already tense, her pulse thudding in her ears. She couldn't ignore it this time. She had to know. She grabbed the flashlight from her bedside table and crept toward the stairs, the beam of light flickering as she ascended. The attic door stood at the top of the stairs, just as it had before, old and worn, with a tarnished brass handle that seemed to glare at her in the dim light. She paused, her breath catching. She knew what she'd find. With a trembling hand, she turned the knob and pushed the door open. It creaked on its hinges, a sound that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The attic was cold. The air was thick with dust, swirling in the beam of her flashlight, but something else seemed to linger, something darker. Shadows flickered in the corners of the room, and as her light swept across the space, Sarah caught glimpses of objects that hadn't been there before. A broken chair, a cracked mirror, and an old, rusted chest pushed against the far wall. Her heart skipped. It was the chest from her childhood, the one she hadn't seen in years. It was locked. She crouched down, running her fingers over the rusted metal, trying to pry it open, but the latch wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding it shut, an invisible force keeping her from uncovering its secrets. Her flashlight flickered, casting a brief shadow on the wall. She hesitated, then opened the chest anyway. Inside were her childhood belongings, old dolls, a stack of crayon drawings, and a few forgotten toys. But what caught her breath was the small notebook buried at the bottom of the chest. She pulled it out. It was from her younger self, written in crayon. Pages were filled with scribbled conversations, her childish scrawl recounting chats with a friend. But as Sarah flipped through, her hand froze. The last few pages were different. They weren't about imaginary play anymore. They were about secrets. How Sarah had seen her mother, crying in the hallway the night she died. How the friend had told her things about her mother's death, things she couldn't possibly know. Sarah's hands shook as the notebook slipped from her grip, falling open to the page where her younger self had written. He said, "I'm next." She gasped, the words echoing in her mind. Something in the house was waking up, and it wasn't done with her yet. Chapter 5. Confronting the Friend. Sarah couldn't shake the nightmares. They came every night now, vivid and relentless, dragging her deeper into the blackness of her fears. In the dreams, the friend was always there, waiting in the shadows, his hollow eyes locked onto hers. a twisted smile stretching across his pale face. "You left me here," he would whisper, his voice a rasping, childlike hiss that scraped at her sanity. "You abandoned me." No matter how hard she tried to run, he would always be there closer each time, his body growing larger, more monstrous. And no matter how fast she moved, she couldn't escape. The worst part? In every nightmare, she could feel his cold fingers brushing against her skin, pulling her back, wrapping around her, dragging her down into the dark where she couldn't breathe. She woke up every morning, drenched in sweat, heart pounding in her chest, the echoes of his voice still ringing in her ears. The air around her was thick with the same oppressive weight, the feeling that she was not alone. It was worse at night. The lights flickered more often now, and the house felt colder, as if something had settled in, something that was growing stronger with every passing hour. Sarah found herself tiptoeing through the rooms, her nerves on edge, expecting to hear his voice at any moment. But she never saw him, only glimpses in the corner of her eye, a shadow here, a flicker of movement there. But then one night, it all changed. She woke suddenly to the sound of a voice low and insistent, calling her name from above. Sarah. It was unmistakable this time. It wasn't just a dream. She could hear him clearly. The attic door, once an afterthought, now felt like a portal to something far worse. With her pulse racing, Sarah knew she couldn't run anymore. She had to face him. She had to confront whatever had been lurking in the house all these years. The walls felt as if they were closing in around her, the house growing darker with every step she took. She grabbed the flashlight and moved to the staircase, her hands shaking. The air grew colder as she ascended, her breath clouding in the beam of her light. The attic door loomed ahead, almost as if it were daring her to open it. And so she did. The door creaked open with a shudder, and there, in the shadows at the far end of the attic, he stood. It wasn't a child anymore. The figure was tall, gaunt, and pale as death. His limbs were long, his skin stretched too thin, his once childish face twisted into something grotesque. His hollow eyes met hers, and the smile, oh, that smile was no longer innocent. It was malicious, twisted, like something born of nightmares. Sarah. The voice echoed through the attic, wrapping around her like a chokehold. He stepped closer, his bare feet making no sound on the floor. "I've been waiting," he whispered, his voice cold and sharp. "Waiting for you to come back." Sarah's legs felt weak, but she forced herself to stand tall. "What are you?" she choked out. He tilted his head, the smile widening as if he were savoring the fear in her voice. "I'm what you've been hiding from. I'm what you've been running from all these years." The air turned ice cold, and Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps. The friend, no, thing that she had once imagined, once pushed away, had grown stronger with each passing year. It had festered in the corners of her mind, trapped by her own denial, until it had become something far darker than a mere childhood fantasy. "Let me out," he demanded, his voice thick with fury. "Let me out, or I'll come for you." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She was trapped, not just in the house, but in the cage of her own memories, the fears she had buried deep, the darkness she had refused to face. The friend had grown powerful, but so had she. She couldn't run anymore. "Why didn't you leave?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He grinned. "Because you didn't want me to." And suddenly, the truth was clear. She had never truly let him go. He had been waiting all these years, a reminder of all the things she had tried to forget, all the secrets she had buried. But now, she had to face him, and there was no going back. Chapter 6. The Unraveling. Sarah couldn't remember how she had gotten to the attic, but she was there again, staring at the same rusted chest, the same dust-covered beams overhead. Her heart pounded in her ears, and her breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. She glanced around the small room, feeling the walls close in, the air thick with something unspoken. The cold was biting, like invisible fingers gripping her skin. How did I get here? Her mind was a mess. She blinked into the darkness, disoriented, trying to piece together the fragments of reality that were slipping away from her. The last thing she remembered was sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at the photograph of her younger self with that damned friend standing beside her, his hollow eyes locked onto hers, his smile mocking her. And now, she was here. She tried to stand, but her legs felt heavy, sluggish, as if they weren't hers. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, sending an echo through the house. She could have sworn she heard footsteps behind her, soft, deliberate. But when she turned, the attic was empty. Only shadows, creeping and shifting in the corners of the room. She shook her head, trying to clear the fog that clung to her brain. The friend had been right. He had always been right. Her thoughts were spiraling, twisting in on themselves like a knot she couldn't untangle. The house. It was pulling her in, as if the walls were alive, breathing, sucking her back into its depths. She stumbled to the door, reaching for the knob, but her fingers fumbled. Her heart raced as the light flickered above her, casting fleeting shadows that danced across the walls like mocking ghosts. She yanked open the door, but the hallway outside felt like a dream distorted, wrong. Sarah stumbled into the corridor, her mind already fragmenting, and she froze. The house was changing. The walls looked different, the wallpaper peeling, and the air had that same suffocating weight she'd felt before, the one that seemed to press on her chest, making every breath a struggle. Suddenly, a low voice echoed from behind her. Sarah. Her pulse spiked. She whipped around, searching for the source, but all she saw were the shadows growing longer, the darkened corners of the house stretching into a void she didn't recognize. The voice was closer now, a whisper that seemed to crawl into her brain, dredging up memories she wasn't ready to face. Sarah, why won't you come back to me? She staggered backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. The walls seemed to close in, warping as the house shifted around her. She couldn't tell if the floor was tilting or if she was losing her grip on reality. Everything felt wrong. And then, through the haze, a flash of something. The photograph. The one she had found earlier. It was in her hands now, but it didn't look the same. The faces were blurred, but his eyes followed her. She could feel them drilling into her, even though the image was still. She blinked, and the photo shifted, the friend's face moving, his eyes widening, a smirk stretching across his face. He wasn't just in the picture anymore. He was there. Get out of my head, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. She pressed her hands to her temples, trying to block out the laughter that echoed through the house, the guttural, childlike giggle that seemed to come from all directions. But it wouldn't stop. The house was alive. It was feeding on her fear, growing stronger with every moment she lost control. Her breathing quickened, and she panicked. She needed to leave, to get out. But the door wouldn't open. No matter how hard she pushed or pulled, it stayed locked like the house itself was holding her prisoner. Let me out, she thought, feeling the weight of the suffocating fear curl around her chest. But the truth was, there was no escaping. She wasn't just trapped in the house. She was trapped in her own mind, losing herself to the memories and fears she had buried so long ago. The walls around her started to close in, the ceiling lowering, the floor shifting beneath her feet, and all Sarah could hear was the sound of that voice growing louder until it filled every crevice of her being. Let me out, Sarah. Let me out. Chapter 7. The Truth. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled through the house, her mind unraveling faster with each passing moment. The walls seemed to pulse, the air thick with an almost tangible darkness. Every shadow, every creak of the floorboards felt like it was reaching out to drag her into the blackness. She couldn't escape. She couldn't even tell if she wanted to anymore. The photo she had found earlier, the one with his eyes following her, was still in her hand, its edges curling and wrinkling as she clutched it like a lifeline. But even as her fingers tightened around it, the friend's face seemed to flicker, a dark smudge against the old family photograph, his grin growing wider, his hollow eyes boring into her soul. She couldn't take it anymore. She couldn't deny it. "He's real," she whispered to herself, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. The sound of her mother's old clock ticking echoed through the house, a grim reminder of the past, of everything Sarah had tried to bury, of the darkness she'd always sensed but never fully understood. But now it was time to face the truth. She couldn't sleep. She hadn't slept for days. The hallucinations were growing more vivid, more intense. Last night, she'd woken up to find her mother standing at the foot of her bed, except it wasn't really her mother. It was a twisted, pale version, with eyes that didn't look like her own. It had whispered Sarah's name, and then, with a shudder, disappeared into the walls. Sarah's mind was cracking, breaking apart, but there was one thing she hadn't done yet: confront him. And so she returned to the attic, the place where everything had started, the place where the truth lay buried. The air in the attic was icy. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps as she climbed the stairs, the flashlight flickering in her hand. She knew he was waiting for her, lurking in the darkness, feeding off her fear, just as he had always done. There he was, standing in the far corner, his twisted figure barely visible in the dim light. The friend, his face pale, gaunt, was no longer that of a child. It was something darker, something older, like a creature of the night that had been feeding on her for years. His smile was twisted, his hollow eyes gleaming in the darkness. "Sarah," he rasped, his voice echoing around the room. She couldn't move. Her legs felt like they were made of stone, her throat tight, as if the house itself was swallowing her whole. But she knew this was it. This was the moment she had been avoiding. She took a trembling breath. "What are you?" she demanded, her voice shaky but resolute. The friend tilted his head, his smile widening. "I am what you've always been afraid of." Sarah's eyes darted around the attic. There was an old chest in the corner, one she hadn't noticed before. She knew she had to open it. There was something inside it that she needed to see. She stumbled toward it, her hands shaking as she pried it open. Inside, she found a hidden, dusty diary. Her mother's handwriting, faded but still legible, filled the pages. The entries were dated back to the time when Sarah was just a child. The words that leapt off the page were like poison. "I didn't know what I was inviting into this house. It's not just a child's imaginary friend. It's something darker, a force that thrives on fear. And now it's feeding off my daughter." Her heart dropped as she read further. Her mother had known. She had known about the entity, but had been powerless to stop it. The friend hadn't just been a figment of her imagination. He was a supernatural force, a malevolent presence that had latched onto her childhood fears, her loneliness, and her mother's neglect. And her mother's death, it was no accident. The truth began to twist in her mind, unraveling her sanity like the threads of a forgotten dream. Her mother had tried to protect her, but the friend had already won. He was bound to the house, and now so was she. "You're trapped here forever," the friend whispered, stepping closer. "Just like your mother." And Sarah understood. The house wasn't just a prison for her. It was a prison for the both of them. And there was only one way out. But first, she had to face him, truly face him. She had to confront the darkness that had been following her for years. As the truth sank in, the weight of it nearly crushed her. She wasn't just battling the friend. She was battling herself. Chapter 8: The Escape. The attic felt smaller than it ever had before, suffocating with the weight of the truth and the presence of the friend. The air was thick with cold, a biting chill that dug into Sarah's bones, the smell of dust and decay mingling with the acrid scent of fear. She could feel it now, the final, terrifying pull, the house itself, closing in on her, as though the very walls were tightening around her, keeping her trapped in its suffocating embrace. The friend, standing in the corner, was no longer the childish figure she had known. His form had changed, twisted, until he was something darker. His gaunt face, the hollow eyes, and the twisted smile were the same, but there was no childlike innocence left. Only malice. "You can't escape, Sarah," he whispered, his voice slithering through the air like a venomous snake. "You're bound here, just like your mother." Sarah's heart thudded wildly in her chest, each beat feeling heavier than the last. She took a step back, her body trembling with the weight of what she was about to face. This wasn't just a battle of wills anymore. It was her last chance to reclaim her life, to confront the past that had haunted her for so long. She couldn't run. She couldn't hide. She glanced around the attic. The chest. The old diary. Her mother's warnings. All of it had led her here, to this final confrontation with the thing that had lurked in the shadows of her childhood, feeding on her fear, twisting her memories. She couldn't bear to stay, but she also couldn't bear to leave without knowing if she was truly free. A single, harsh breath escaped her lips as she stepped closer to the friend, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." The friend tilted his head, the smirk on his face widening as though he found her defiance amusing. "Oh, but you are. You always have been. You've just been too scared to face it." Sarah's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Her mother's death, the long years of loneliness, the memories she had buried. All of it had fed the friend, had kept him alive. He thrived on fear, on her weakness, on the darkness inside her that she had tried to ignore. But she wouldn't ignore it anymore. She remembered the diary, the hidden pages of her mother's journal that had described how the friend had been welcomed into the house, how the darkness had seeped in when Sarah was just a child. She was the key. Her fear had kept him here, and it was her fear that would set her free. With trembling hands, she reached into her pocket, pulling out the old photo, her mother's last words written on the back. "You must face the darkness to escape it." The friend's eyes narrowed as Sarah stepped forward, her voice more determined. "I know what you are. You're not real. You're just a part of me, part of what I've been running from. But I won't run anymore." The attic grew darker, colder, the air heavier with each passing second. Friend's smile twisted into a snarl, his eyes blazing with fury. "Then you will never leave." But Sarah wasn't backing down. She took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of strength she had left, and she did the only thing she could. She faced him. "I refuse to be afraid of you." There was a moment of silence, long and heavy. And then, with a deafening crash, the attic door slammed shut behind her, leaving only the cold silence. The friend's figure began to distort, his body flickering like a broken light. Sarah's breath hitched as she watched the shadows twist and writhe, as if the house itself was tearing at the seams. The walls groaned, the ceiling creaked, and the house seemed to shudder under the weight of the truth. She ran for the door, her heart pounding, and yanked it open. The hallway outside looked the same, silent, dark. She didn't know if she had truly escaped or if she was still trapped in some kind of nightmare, forever bound to the house. And then, as she stepped into the hallway, she heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible, coming from the shadows. "You can never leave." Her blood ran cold. The door to the attic slammed shut behind her, the whispers growing louder, filling the air with the sound of her name. Sarah froze. The house was alive, and maybe, just maybe, so was she. The door to the attic creaked once more. The whispers never stopped. But whether she had escaped or was still trapped, that was a truth only the house knew.